Yo, yo, it's time to discover the flow. Shout out to the bros, you know. I like to welcome everybody to discover the flow. No matter how you discover the show or discover the bros, now you about to see how far we can go, because it's time for discover the flow. Yeah, cowabunga do, you know live is how we come to you. Turn the levels up when you hear the boys coming through. The Pod Squad giving you just what you need, hitting you with a new special guest every week. Don't you dare hit skip, man, it's Tristan and Kip. DTF Pod about to take you on a trip. Mega Ran bring the heat, yeah. But be clear, I wasn't even supposed to be here. Welcome to Discover the Flow. No matter how you discovered the show or discovered the bros, now you about to see how far we can go, because it's time for Discover the Flow. Let's start the show.
So where are you at in the world right now?
It's Stanford.
Oh, at Stanford. Okay. Yeah, I saw the list of different places where you've taught at. It's pretty impressive. So you spent some time out here in Chicago, I saw at one point.
Yeah, that's right. Many years ago, one of my very early in my career, I had a 1-year job at the University of Chicago. It was great fun to be in Chicago.
Yeah, we're about a half hour, 40 minutes outside of Chicago right now.
Which direction?
I don't know if you've ever heard of Naperville.
No, sorry.
Yeah, no, we're out west. We're west of Chicago.
Sure. Cool.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
okay.
All right.
So you do a lot of work in history involving World War II and Adolf Hitler, to be specific.
Sure.
What kind of? I know I've haven't read a lot because I didn't have a whole lot of time to read a lot of books for it, but I know Hitler. There's a lot of discrepancies as far as what kind of person he actually was. Like the going idea is that he was a well-spoken, confident individual, but your book says differently, correct? Did I understand that?
Yeah, I think that is right. But I mean, the way what I was going to say is I think there's also this kind of image of Hitler as the demon. So it's this very well-spoken, confident demon who is kind of constantly shouting and screaming, who's motivated by primordial emotions, by hatred and all that. Mm-hmm. And I think that is, I mean, there's of course a lot of truth in it, but it's also kind of the cartoon version of Adolf Hitler, really on two levels. I mean, on one level, and I guess that is what you were referring to as regards to my book, this was actually a person who was sometimes not so confident, who had to take many twists and turns to get to where he was, who initially didn't feel particularly secure in his own skin, who didn't want to be photographed, who didn't really want to talk about his past. So that is in a way a person very different from that kind of public image that we have. And even later, Hitler created this public persona of himself, which was this very confident person who talks about everything. But in a way, this was a public persona that he had created, and kind of the person behind it kind of remains an enigma. And beyond that, and this goes to the part, kind of the demon part. I think in a way we want to kind of keep Hitler at a distance, and then to present Hitler as the incarnation of absolute evil and of demon, and to being a demon is kind of comfortable. But of course, he was a human being. He was a human being who, with fairly normal emotions, who also, in a way, was really a man of ideas. I mean, the ideas might have been horrible, but who was trying to really understand the world, trying to understand what was wrong with the world, why he thought that Germany was facing existential threat for survival, who was trying to figure out what is the hidden architecture of the world? How do I need to revamp Germany to make sure that Germany can survive? And kind of the principles on which he then built his worldview, they're of course irrational or full of hatred or whatever. But once you accept those principles, what the edifice that he creates on top of that is fairly coherent. There is a kind of rationality or bounded rationality of Hitler's thinking. So yes, it's based on kind of hatred, but within those boundaries, things are fairly rational.
You talk about like a little bit of misconception about his personality. There's we live in a world now where AI seems to be taking over and you know, doing different things, and some people are scared of it and some people aren't. But I've seen some videos recently where AI has taken old speeches of Hitler's and translated them so that you could actually understand them from Austrian or German or whatever. And a lot of times when we grow up and we watch videos like that, we see the perception of, like you said, of like him slamming his fist and talking very, you know, vibrantly and yelling and this and that. And it sounds scary because we don't understand it. But quite often when that stuff is translated, he's not really talking about anything evil or diabolical, for lack of a better term. Most of the time it was just policy and his different ideas and stuff. So like, I could see how he could be misunderstood in ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, not misunderstood in the sense that of saying, look, he wasn't so bad. I mean, not at all. That isn't the point at all. But to understand his success, it's also generally now when we see clips of Hitler in documentaries or whatever, they're the last 5 or 10 seconds of a 2.5 hour long speech, which were very skillful, where Hitler obviously didn't scream and shout for 2.5 hours. For most of his career, there wasn't even microphones, so he couldn't have shouted for 2.5 hours. He was sometimes he was almost whispering and so on. And once he had his audience totally in his hand, then towards the end, as there was crescendo, he would kind of start to shout. But these are the last 5 or 10 seconds of his speech. And there's this fascinating short clip recorded secretly by a Finnish sound technician during the Second World War, which is the only recording where Hitler is kind of recorded when he is not on stage or when he is not speaking for public consumption. And he sounds totally differently. And sometimes at talks or whatever, I'll play this at the beginning and ask them, people, do you recognize who's speaking here? In order to kind of change to understand that people have the wrong understanding of how Hitler worked, because there he has got this slightly guttural Austrian accent, but in a way he sounds quite likable in there. This is a totally different persona from that screening guy. And in a way, what you've just said about AI, and thought about how this can be used this way, in a way it's clever, because the problem is, of course, once you translate Hitler into different language, or just listen to it in German, then it sounds harsh. Or rather, even, for instance, if you do kind of old-style Hollywood movies about the Nazis, they were always speaking with a strong German accent and always sounded aggressive. But obviously, when Germans speak themselves, they don't have a strong accent. They just sound normal. So in a way, it's clever to listen to it through AI in English, because that way you get a sense also of how Hitler would have sounded to a German, which would have been someone without an accent and someone who was not constantly shouting or sounding aggressive.
It would almost sound more like what we expect a politician to sound like now.
Exactly.
You know, an American politician for us, just sitting there talking and, you know, giving a fireside chat, if you will. And it would, as opposed to being this frenzy whipping production, which is what they actually seem to be showing all the time. Every clip that I've ever seen has always looked like some kind of a production.
Yeah,
almost like he's acting.
That's right.
There's always been rumors also of him being or using large amounts of amphetamines and stuff before his speeches. Do you know if there was any truth to stuff like that?
I think less so before his speeches. I think it was more that during the war, he was starting to take more and more those kind of substances. I mean, there's some disagreement over this, because in part this depends on what we make of the handwritings of Hitler's doctors. So, which was terrible. So some people who says, well, this says amphetamines, others say no, it means something else. But it seems extremely likely and plausible that during the war he was increasingly taking them, that he was, as a result of that, becoming more and more erratic also in the way he was speaking and so on. But this was also at a time in which Hitler gave fewer and fewer speeches. However, it is actually true that he was, before speeches, even early in his career, he was really kind of preparing, but also he was trying. In fact, he needed energy, and this was, of course, also a time in which, particularly the 1920s, food was relatively scarce, and in Germany after the First World War, and he would, for instance, just before that, he would just eat a raw egg, because he would see that would give him energy. But I mean, the way that they're interesting story about how all these Nazis kind of prepare for their speeches and sometimes try to get energy, sometimes take substances in order to be more confident. So, for instance, we know of Rudolf Hess, who was Hitler's second in command, who was extremely shy, who really hated public speaking. And the few times he had to give public speeches, he was so nervous that before he always got himself a bottle of pink sparkling wine, which he would then drink until he had enough confidence to give his speech.
Liquid courage, huh?
Good old Vino Veritas.
Indeed.
Open up the tongue. So one of the phrases that I heard and read actually, I should say, I didn't hear it, but one of the phrases that I heard was, or read, keep saying heard, rear area pig. Is that as a description of the kind of person that Hitler was as a younger man?
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to his time during the First World War. So during the First World War, Hitler served as a dispatch runner for regimental headquarters, and Hitler would later create this version of his public self, in which he was this courageous soldier who ran from trench to trench through machine gun fire, and where the story would be, look, the life for soldiers was terrible, but at least they had some protection in the trenches, while Hitler just ran through machine gun fire and so on. This was part of telling the story of National Socialism being born in the trenches of the First World War, and Hitler being the personification of Germany's unknown soldier, but who was still even more courageous than everyone else, and so on. But this was an partially invented story, because the man in the trenches, they often thought of people like Hitler as people who had a comfy life, because as he was a dispatcher for regimental headquarters, he generally didn't have to take messages right to the trenches, but generally had to take them from regimental headquarters to battalion headquarters, or to other higher up units, and that was still dangerous, particularly because of the danger of artillery fire during the First World War. And Hitler, objectively speaking, was very conscientiously following orders. So the point is less here whether he wasn't courageous or whatever else, but in the perception of the man in the trenches, he was therefore an Etappenschwein, or which literally is rear area pig, but it would be whatever. Of course, the more common term in America would be reactionary motherfucker. Mm-hmm. So the idea was, look, these guys have a comfy life. They have the good life at regimental headquarters. They can sleep in the bed at night. they're not surrounded by rats. And they get all the honors because they know the guys who have the power to nominate people for medals. And so there was a lot of kind of animosity towards people like Hitler, which on one level is kind of almost unfair. This goes back to what I've just said. Is the point is not whether, objectively speaking, Hitler was courageous or wasn't courageous. The point here is that because of the perception of the man in the trenches, Hitler couldn't have used his story of the First World War as a kind of politically useful tale to tell the story of National Socialism being born in the trenches. I mean, it wouldn't be a very good story to tell. Well, National Socialism was born in the trenches, but the Führer was seen, was a reactionary motherfucker. So in that sense, he needed to create a different version of his own past that would be politically useful.
So basically, he fabricated his military background or military history to pump himself up in the eyes of others. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. So he basically told a story is of him being kind of respected and loved by everyone, when kind of the opposite was the case. I mean, even in the interwar years, when there were all these meetings of veterans of his unit, he really only once showed up for a meeting, and then never did so again. And as we actually know from a surviving postcard written by the wife of one of his peers, this was precisely because they didn't, because they knew that the men of the from the trenches did not hold people like Hitler in high esteem.
Now, I know he used a lot of propaganda and turmoil from the Great Depression and the Treaty of Versatiles after World War I to try to rise to power. But I mean, how does an Austrian soldier pretty much take over Germany and begin to take over the world? Like, what was his rise like?
In the early 1920s, he was very clever in telling a story of himself. So this really starts of how he just initially appears in this small party. This is really kind of a fringe group, and he just has more talent than others to speak, to entertain, and also you have to bear in mind this is the time before the internet, before TV, before cinemas, and so on. So people at nighttime, they often go to public events for entertainment. So they go to these beer halls in Munich of different political parties. I mean, people also go to events of parties they might not even support, because it's kind of good entertainment. So you listen to someone, and while you listen, you have a few drinks with your friends, and then you go home. That's kind of the entertainment for the evening. And they're having a speaker who's just a better speaker and a more entertaining speaker than anyone else, allows Hitler to kind of first appear. But that wouldn't have, of course, made it possible for Hitler to rise to the very top. And he really had kind of course, the challenge was technically he wasn't a German, so he was Austrian. He was a school dropout. He didn't have some kind of fancy pedigree. So in a way, this was kind of all forbidding in order to make a career in politics. But then he must have realized that there was this yearning in Germany, interwar Germany, for a total new political light leader, for genius. There was this craving for geniuses to emerge who would lead Germany out of misery. And a genius, according to this kind of principle, was a very specific idea. A genius is, you can't train to be a genius. You're born as a genius. It's innate. It comes with, and also it does not come from some fancy background. In fact, according to this genius idea, these are normally people who come somewhere out of nowhere, but who just have this inborn talent, and who then, while they grow up, often through hardship experience, they have all these revelations about the nature of things, and they're totally capable of doing something totally different, to really break through, write totally new books, to compose works of music that will last for centuries. And Hitler saw this as an opening, because now suddenly his non-pedigree, his hardship as growing up, he could all turn into an asset. He could tell the story of this boy from the German-Austrian borderlands who had come out of nowhere, and who would lead Germany out of misery. And one other thing needs to be added here. This was kind of, well, it's crisis perception. It's this idea that people think that they're living in the greatest crisis ever, not just a crisis, but the greatest crisis ever. And they think that those up there, the politicians up there, the old elite, they have all messed it up. They don't have what it takes to get out of the crisis. And this is when people are willing to listen to new prophets, to new kind of populists who come up with explanations of why there's a crisis and how you can get out of the crisis. And here is Hitler presenting himself as this genius who has totally new insights and who tells a kind of compelling story of how we can get out of the crisis. And that kind of really then helps Hitler to rise and ultimately to come to power.
Now, I'm going to probably butcher this, but there's something called the Beer Hall Putsch.
Putsch.
Putsch. Okay. Yes. So this was a failed coup in 1923 that was attempted when they were trying to overthrow one of the republics there. Like, can you tell us more about that?
Sure. So in November of 1923, Hitler, for the first time, tries to seize power. And the context here, again, is that suddenly there was... So Hitler had really entered politics 4 years earlier. He had slowly becoming more prominent. And then by 1922, in Italy, of course, Mussolini takes over. And there's a lot of talk about, well, look, something like that should be possible in Germany as well, and in Bavaria, where Hitler still is. People might say, well, can't Hitler be the Bavarian Mussolini? And then in 1923, both the political situation and the economic situation really get totally out of control. And there's widespread belief on both sides of the political extreme that revolution is in the air. The left think that there will be a world revolution. The nationalists, I think, well, look, we can have a nationalist revolution. And it is in this context that Hitler and his allies think like, well, if revolution is in the air, we should lead the revolution. And their attempt in November of 1923 to pull off this nationalist right-wing revolution, but they kind of fail miserably. They kind of miscalculated. I mean, they storm into this beer hall where all the traditional groups and elites of Bavaria had met up. Hitler just goes to the front. He just shoots into the ceiling and declares a national revolution. He asked kind of the leaders to come with him to a back room. He said, well, the revolution has now started, but then he makes a fatal mistake. He just lets them go in order to implement the revolution. But the moment that they let him go, they just order Bavarian state police and so on to stop the coup. And so at that point, the coup has just failed. Hitler ends up in prison. Hitler is suicidal. He thinks this is the end. And but then something surprising happens that he realizes that he can turn this into kind of a triumph. Because when he is taken to court, he's very angry. He wants to take everyone else down with him. He wants to convince he wants to kind of tell the public and the judges how who else knew about this, and that some of the traditional parties had also knew about it and wanted to start a trial. They, meanwhile, want to blame him for everything. Then he realizes, hang on a minute, that's great. If they blame me for everything, I can finally be the prominent leader I want to be. So he basically then sees this as an opportunity and just accepts responsibility for everything. Of course, he ends up in prison, but then he starts writing Mein Kampf, and then he's this mythical figure who's now in prison, who supposedly is responsible for everything. And so ultimately, in a way, we see here something quite typical of Hitler, his talent of turning defeats into triumphs. So Hitler is he's generally figuring out things. He generally knows the direction he wants to take things, but he is not trying to now plan the next 15 steps of how this is being implemented. And that, in a way, is actually one of his strengths, because that allows him a lot of flexibility. So when stuff happens and things sometimes look bad, he just exploits those moments and moves things very skillfully closer to where he wanted to get them. So the coup failed, but ultimately he is the beneficiary. It's even with the coup, when the coup starts, he is doing the coup together with this First World War general, Ludendorff, who was far more famous in Germany at that time than Hitler. Outside of Bavaria, people had barely heard about Hitler yet. So when newspapers across Germany report the Hitler putsch in the days after the failure, this is called the Ludendorff putsch, or the Ludendorff-Hitler putsch. So Hitler is almost kind of an afterthought in the public perception. But then during his trial, it starts as the Ludendorff-Hitler trial, and by the time the trial ends, it's the Hitler trial. So he's really brilliantly has exploited that.
So he used this to his advantage.
Yes.
Interesting. It's a pretty slick thing to do to turn that around, to try to change your perception, or at least in other people's eyes, you know.
He really
Absolutely,
does sound,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, he really does sound like he was a PR machine, just an amazing public relations mind in this respect.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you've really nailed it there. I mean, we also have to bear in mind that even when Hitler initially joins the Nazi Party, that is really his job. What sometimes people forget is that Hitler was neither the founder of the party, nor was he initially the chairman. But so when he joins this party, it's extremely small. I mean, calling it a party is almost a misnomer. It's really more kind of a secret society or something like that. And they hire him, or they want him to sign on, because he realizes this guy can speak. He can be officially he's called the Propaganda-Obmann, or the propaganda representative on the board. Propaganda at that time had a neutral connotation, so it didn't have, propaganda was not necessarily something bad. So for instance, the British had during the First World War a director of propaganda. So that so this is precisely, today we would just call it PR. So he was, that is something he always thought about, but also that he performed. And he was really extremely successful and skilled in communications. And also he knew that is something that he would have to pursue for the rest of his life, and also take other people on board who have the same or even greater talents there. And in a way, this also explains why later Goebbels played such a prominent role in the Third Reich, because Hitler in a way was strong enough that he realized look, here is someone who might be even better at selling a political salesmanship. And so he just co-opts him in. And this is actually, by the way, also because, I mean, there's another public misconception about Hitler and the Germans. there's this kind of idea that Hitler always thinks that that Germans are this is super race and the greatest and so on. The reality is actually Hitler has a fairly low opinion of a lot of Germans. He thinks that just like in Germany, just like in any other nation, the majority of the people, they're kind of marked by inertia, they're indolent, they don't get off the sofas, and they just go along with whatever. And so therefore, he thinks that the key to Germany's survival is to get people off the sofa. And for that, and that is why political communication is so important. This is why propaganda is so important. This is why he ultimately sets up a National Socialism as almost a kind of religion or political religion of action, because he thinks that using this kind of quasi-religious language in a very clever way, with promises of sin, that sin can be overcome, that there can be national redemption, that there can be personal redemption. It is all those kind of promises that Hitler very skillfully uses, with which he does manage to get the Germans off their sofas.
That's interesting, because we were always taught growing up that Hitler thought that the German people were the ultimate race, and there's always the picture painted in the media of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, perfect soldier. So to hear that he didn't even think very much of his own people, technically, it's kind of it's one of those things that messes with your mind, you know what I mean? Because we quite often are taught what I like to refer to as revisionist history growing up. We don't get the full picture until we're adults and we start taking more interest in topics on our own, like to find out how charismatic he was, and that he wasn't just a painter, but he was an architect too, that really admired the I'm trying to remember what it was, but like the different structures of like ancient Rome and stuff like that. And that's why he wanted the capital in Germany to look a certain way. But they always tell us that he was a failed painter and a failed architect. Was he really failed, or was it just another attack over the years, because of the person that he was?
It's both true and untrue at the same time. I mean, of course, on one level, it is true. I mean, it is true in the sense that he was not admitted to the art school. It's true in the sense that, for instance, with his paintings, he could only sell them in the street and was sometimes struggling with that. But there's also, again, a danger here. This is that we somehow always want to kind of belittle everything that Hitler was doing. So, for instance, also, people say Hitler was utterly unoriginal. He was just reading with confirmation bias. He had no talents as a artist and all that. That's a half-truth. But the real point is actually to ask, why is this guy reading every day every evening of his life, even when he's extremely busy? Why does he think he needs to write? Why does he think that he has got to write all these books and articles about the nature of things? Because he clearly thinks of himself as a man of ideas, and it is his reading and what he writes that is then structuring his actions. So in a way, at our peril, we'll kind of, again, turn Hitler into a cartoon version, not realizing what he was really like. And a lot of these things that we just talked about in the last 2 minutes, in a way, are also central to understanding some of the central features of Hitler. So, for instance, we now know through new information as recently has come to light is that, in part, I mean, it goes back to this kind of being a failed painter. I mean, failed maybe, this is not about whether or not he has a talent, but he's failing in the sense that he didn't get into art school, and that he thinks that he is not really getting enough money for his paintings. And as he then tells the people with whom he's lodging in Munich just before the First World War, he's blaming Jews for screwing him over. So we have to look at these things to understand how Hitler radicalizes. Of course, the point here is not to say that somehow this is now the fault of some Jew who didn't pay for the painting. This is about understanding Hitler's own way of looking at the world. Or what you've just said is interesting about Rome. It's not only that we're so often told that Hitler or the Nazis just thought about the Germans as this kind of blonde super race. It's also this kind of idea that we're just thinking about this northern world, and that is what he was ultimately thriving for. That is true for people like Himmler and a few others. They indeed had these kind of Nordic fantasies of Nordic art, of Nordic gods, of rebuilding this lost Nordic world. Hitler couldn't care less about that kind of Nordic world. He loved the art and the traditions of Greece and Rome. He loved Italian Renaissance art. He loved Italian opera. He never even visited Scandinavia when he could. In his speeches in the 1920s, he never talks about countries like Iceland, which supposedly is where this original Nordic country originated from. He mentions, I think, Norway once or twice over several years. When he talks about Sweden, he only talks about ore output in Sweden. This kind of Nordic world is something that Hitler goes along with because he knows that some people in the Nazi party, they really have these dreams about about this Nordic world, and he doesn't contradict them. He publicly goes along with it, but privately says, "Look, this is all weird stuff," and he doesn't pick up on it publicly. He just let them be.
Interesting. I want to shift just a little bit and
Sure.
and have some fun with the conversation. I know that's a weird term to use when the topic is Hitler and World War II, but I've always found it interesting with the 1936 Summer Olympics. Hitler is credited because it was under his regime, but it was Karl Diem, where the modern day Olympics, kind of as we know it, was created, by Hitler and his party with the Olympic torch and the relay and the flame and the marching in ceremony and all that. Like, that's an interesting thing to think about, that we still carry on those traditions today when they came from a man that we often refer to as one of the greatest monsters in history. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, there is in many ways, we all live in the world that Hitler created. Generally, of course, in ways that we self-consciously sort of respond against, but also in ways where, in a way, we go along. I mean, we kind of, again, we do not seem to have a problem to have a march relay from Greece to wherever Olympics are taking place, even though that's Nazi pageantry. This is Nazi propaganda. This is precisely the kind of staging that the Nazis were very good at.
Yeah, I've always been kind of interested by that, because if you don't know better, you just look at it like, oh, well, this is the way it's always been done. But then once you find out, it kind of sits there and settles in your brain. You're like, oh, this makes sense that this was created by like the Nazi party, the way that it falls out. But we also the German party and the Nazi party, they had this amazing. I'm trying to think of the word here. Basically, their scientists were sought out by the world, that like they were basically given, pardons, for lack of a better term, to go to Russia and to go to the States and this and that. Like, did Hitler seek out these people throughout, to have him as a part of his party, or is it just like a natural thing with the German scientists? Like, are they just vastly superior?
That's a good question. Let me think about it. I think it's basically a question that at that point, German academia had been world leading. Really from the late 19th century onwards, in a way, in a lot of particularly science and technology subjects, Germany was kind of the center of things. I mean, in a way, they were the kind of the Stanfords or Harvards or MITs of the time would have all been in Germany, the early 20th century Germany. And as a result of that, you have these kind of amazing scientists in Germany. Of course, the Nazis also, they destroyed a lot of that stuff in 1933. But particularly in technology, they kind of let things go because they don't see this as, I mean, they see universities generally as a challenge, but not kind of so much in the science. And as a result of that, you have all these scientists there. You also have world-leading industrial researchers, and that is one of the reasons why Germany can, of course, sustain the war for so long. I mean, there's all kind of scholarship that now points out that, well, look, a lot of these people were also maybe not that great, or that that point out that maybe German technology X or Y was not as leading as whatever else. But I never find that particularly persuasive, because that in a way is also a backwards reading of history, where you now somehow want to explain why ultimately Germany lost the war. But the question is not why Germany ultimately lost the war, but why Germany could sustain the war for so long against the odds, against the world of enemies. And I think that has a lot to do with these scientists and the way they were involved in the war effort. And I guess precisely the point that you were making, that they were then sold out by both the Russians and the Americans, and in many ways stood then at the center of the kind of new nuclear race. Does show that these were clearly world-leading scientists and innovators.
Well, yeah, I mean, we took a lot of people that, probably should have been on trial for crimes against humanity, but then had great advancements from people like Werner von Braun, who gave us NASA.
Sure.
You know what I mean? But what do you know about, if anything, the German Bell, or as they call it, again, if I mispronounce something, I apologize. Die Glocke, is that proper?
What are we talking about?
The bell, which was one of Hitler's supposed secret projects, where Wunderwaffe developed in the 1940s in Nazi Germany, where they were trying to experiment with what, it sounds silly, but they were trying to experiment with what they refer to as time travel.
I really know. Sorry, I wished I could answer the question, but I really can't.
That's all right. It's perfectly fine. It's one of those things that I was just curious, like if there was any truth to that, because I mean, again, weird guy, did a lot of weird things. I mean, he was even supposedly a big Disney fan. So you just you never know.
That part is true. I mean, in a way, it's kind of possible, because I mean, you have, of course, all this kind of idea of Wunderwaffen, but that in a way, of course, is just a way of being more innovative and coming up with weapon technology that is just more advanced. The V rockets, of course, ultimately didn't quite deliver, and in part because they were just not, the precision wasn't great enough. Otherwise, they would have been a terrible weapon. But the Germans, of course, had developed jet planes. They just hadn't developed them fast enough yet. But had the jet planes that the Germans had created by the end of the war, if they could have been mass produced, So in a way, if this just all happened about 1 year earlier, it probably would have been a game changer. Also, of course, the Germans were doing research on nuclear technology, which was quite far advanced. And some people argue that maybe some scientists maybe deliberately were slowing things down a little bit because they were so worried about how these could have been used. But if they had been ready, again, maybe if things had just started 1 year earlier, we could have ended up with a totally different outcome. But the Nazis also, or not, I shouldn't say the Nazis, some Nazis, and maybe even including some Hitler, with that I'm a little less sure, there was this belief also in the supernatural. And so in that sense, I wouldn't be surprised if they are open to this idea. Well, let's explore time travel. I mean, this would be in keeping or in sync with this kind of belief in the supernatural and so on. The person to ask would probably be historian Eric Kurlander at Stetson University in Florida.
Okay.
That's pretty interesting. You hear, like I said, a lot of different things, and you never know really what might be true, what might be fabricated, or what just came from the internet. So sorting it out can be kind of fun in my eyes. When you're sorting out history and learning fact from fiction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as a political historian, what I see a lot of going on right now, excuse me, is there's a lot of parallels being drawn, and not always necessarily accurate parallels, but there are a lot of parallels being drawn between current leaders and Hitler as a person. Is there any real merit to that kind of labeling? I mean, are there things that are actually accurate, or is it just a lot of finger pointing and rage baiting and things like that?
I think it's a little bit of both, and I think I often say, in a way, we're asking the wrong questions. I mean, we're asking too much. Is politician X Hitler? Are we experiencing a 1933 moment? While maybe what we should be asking is, are we seeing the kind of the engines of democratic breakdown in a similar way that we're seeing in the interwar years? Maybe the point is not to compare politician X to Hitler, or to look at whether the actual form of democratic breakdown is like in 1933, but maybe we should look at what is undermining democracy, or the tremendous power of disinformation and demagoguery, or what does happen when this kind of idea of living in a world of crisis comes together with sudden innovation in mass communications, as happened at the time with radio, cinema news, illustrated magazines, or today certainly happening with the digital world. So I think there we certainly see parallels. Then beyond that, I think it depends a little bit on which politicians we're talking about, which country we're talking about, and whether we're talking about at the core about ideology, or if we're talking about, for instance, political styles, political rhetoric, how certain things are being used as a tactic. When we talk about countries, I'm generally not convinced by these fascism or National Socialism comparison with America today. And this is not because I somehow think about things are not bad or things are bad or whatever else. I think it's a totally different question. But at its core, National Socialism, the principle is Gemeinnutz vor Eigennutz. The common good trumps the individual good. And this belief in an extremely strong state to create all this. But certainly with Trumpism, it's the exact inversion. It's this kind of idea that the pursuit of individualism, of individual advantage, is creating a common good. So it's the exact inversion of that. It's also ultimately a belief in a small state. It's and maybe there we also have, even what we see over the last 47 days or whatever it is, we have a kind of paradox. The power of the state is being used to destroy institutions of the state. Now, it's a question of our political preferences, whether we think this is a good or bad thing. But the Nazis used the power of the state to create an even bigger, even greater political institutions, while the Trump administration is using the power of the state to shrink the state. So there I see a major difference. But if we go to some European countries and look at some of the far-right parties there in a way, it's kind of interesting about how similar some of their political demands are to the political demands that the Nazis had in the 1920s. So and people often don't realize it. It goes back to what we discussed at the beginning, that people have this kind of cartoon version of the Nazis in their head. So it's the Hitler who always screams, who always is just, in a way, is waking up in the morning and thinking, who can I kill today? But if you look not at the cartoon version of the Nazis, but looking at what the Nazis really did in the 1920s and what their political goals were, you do realize that maybe unlike in the US, that there is a lot of parallels. Again, this is not about the question to ask whether we're living in a scary moment. We're not living in a scary moment. So the questioning the parallel here is not to say everything is fine or everything is not fine. It's basically just to say, if there's a challenge, it's a challenge of a different kind. However, if once we get to the use of certain political language, if we look at tactics, I think then it's easy to see some parallels. And I think they also, in the case of Donald Trump, they grew stronger over the years. So I think it was about a year and a half ago, early in his campaign, the re-election campaign, he started to talk about as immigrants as now I can't remember the exact quote, but vermin as poisoning the bloodstream of the American people and all that. And that is Nazi language.
Okay.
I got to touch on something that you had mentioned earlier when you were talking about the perception of Nazis and Germans and everything like that in a cartoonish way. Just on behalf of American people everywhere for over the years, sorry we always made you guys the bad guys in all of our films. You know what I mean?
Well, in many ways, of course, we were the bad guys at the time, so we don't want to keep the bad guys.
We can't let one bad apple spoil the whole bunch. You know what I mean?
Okay,
but I mean, you guys do make awesome bad guys in movies, though. But before we have a questionnaire invented by Bernard Pivot that we like to wrap up with. So, but before we do that, I got one last question, and this is strictly your opinion. The bunker. Does Hitler die in there? Or does he escape to Argentina?
He dies in the bunker because for two reasons. One is for three reasons. The one is actually we have an abundance of testimony of people who were involved in disposing his body and so on. So you really would have got to believe in a lot of conspiracies.
Well, yeah, there's conspiracies that it was a double, which politicians have always
either
had.
That or that all these people are onto this and they're all lying and so on. But these guys have repeatedly been interviewed over the years. And actually, I've recently come across new interviews with people who disposed of Hitler's body.
I've seen specials where they supposedly are testing his skull fragments and stuff like that.
That is indeed that is part two of the answer. Is that there are part of the skull and I think of the teeth in Moscow. So that has been tested and has proven that he is dead. So now you would actually have got to make the conspiracy even bigger. So where the Russians are now also part of that conspiracy, and all the people who say that they saw how he died, or rather how he was dead. And then the third part is it just doesn't make sense that he would have excluded. In a way, that's maybe the most important point, and the point people normally don't focus upon, because they focus on the forensics. But the question here is just a question of personality. Hitler is not he didn't have the kind of personality who would somehow be in the limelight for decades, and who would then so much wants to live that he would rather than kind of live in total oblivion in Argentina. Yes, those people also existed, but that's not Hitler. Hitler is someone who wants to be at the center of things. He would hate the idea that he would just be a no one, a nobody. So from
too big of an ego to go off and hide,
Exactly. So from Hitler's perspective, it's much better to die, because then you die as the greatest guy ever from his perspective, rather than to flee, to have this life in oblivion. Plus, he was also, and that is another point that is important to bear in mind, Hitler was extremely worried that what would happen if he fell into the hands of particularly the Russians. And of course, by the time he would have had to flee, flee through Russian lines. We know that, for instance, he saw, I think he was still shown photographs of what had been done to the bodies of Mussolini and his lover, who of course had been first killed and then be hung up upside down a gas station in Italy. And he was really worried about something like that. He was worried that he would be displayed in a cage on Red Square in Moscow. And for all this reason, it's just not plausible that Hitler would somehow have tried to get out of the country and sail to Argentina, even though a lot of them did.
That was a hell of a way to spend your honeymoon.
Indeed.
I don't know if you're a big movie guy or not, but have you ever seen a movie called Jojo Rabbit?
Yes, absolutely.
I love the idea of Hitler being played by a Hasidic Jew.
I love the film. It's a great film.
It's a fantastic movie.
Yeah.
But Kip.
Yep. So we're going to start this Bernard Pivot questionnaire. Just give answers as they come to you, and elaborate if you want. Don't have to, but Dr. Weber, what is your favorite word?
So what's my favorite?
Your favorite word.
Oh, what's my favorite word? Hope.
What is your least favorite word?
Hate.
What sound or noise do you love?
People laughing.
What sound or noise do you hate?
People speaking too loudly.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Either being a journalist or a diplomat.
What profession other than your own would you not like to attempt?
Being a butcher.
Creatively speaking, what turns you on?
Someone who's challenging me, someone who's really bright and who's challenging me. I never understood this saying that it's better to be a big fish in a small pond than to being a small fish in a big pond. I kind of love the idea of being challenged by really smart people.
Okay. In the same vein, what turns you off creatively?
Self-important people who think that they know everything.
Okay. What is your favorite curse word?
I was going to say I don't curse, but the just probably not entirely true. I try not to curse, but probably damn.
Damn. Okay.
How do you say that in German?
I normally swear in English.
Ah,
It's good language for that.
Yeah, it's true, but it's also, I mean, I'm married to a Canadian, and our family language is English.
Okay. And the final question of this questionnaire, if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Your friends and family who have gone before you are all waiting for you.